Sea Otter Awareness Week. So welcome to the final day of Sea Otter Awareness Week, the 15th annual Sea Otter Awareness Week 2017. Let's give it Thank you. So what does Sea Otter awareness mean? Why should we bother being aware of sea otters? We have North Korea has the bomb. We have a divided political administration. Superstorms are hitting the Florida coast. Why should we care about sea otters? I can't answer that question for you. I can answer it for myself. And I think about my days as an undergrad at Oregon State University, and we had a speaker come visit. His name was David Ehrenfeld. He's a noted conservation biologist. I think he was the founding editor of the Conservation Biology Journal. And during his talk, he advised us to let the healing of the earth spread out from our doorstep. The California coast is my doorstep. Sea otters are my neighbors. And this is my way of spreading a little bit about healing. So as you take in all that you learned during Sea Otter Awareness Week, try to remember and appreciate some of the things about sea otters that go beyond the very simple, superficial appeal that we all know that they have. They are spreading the healing just by living their lives in the places where they were once nearly extirpated and now belong. So think about that as you listen to Dr. Tinker's talk. And I'm just going to say a couple words about Tim. Tim was the very first person to hire me over the phone, sight unseen, for my first sea otter job in 2001. If it weren't for Tim, I wouldn't be standing here right now, so thank you so much for that. And maybe he regrets it, I don't know. But I'm going to introduce someone who I really think can give a proper introduction, heartfelt. This is Lillian Carswell, and she's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Southern Sea Otter Recovery Coordinator. Lillian, without further ado.
Hi, and welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming. So some of you know that Dr. Tim Tinker is leaving the country for Canada at the end of the year. Hope that was public knowledge, Tim.
It is now.
So it's with a little emotion that I stand here tonight to introduce him, and that's why I actually had notes. I don't usually use notes, but I just thought, if I start to cry, I'll just hold them up. Anyway, Tim's been involved in sea otter research for about a quarter century, and I know he doesn't look old enough for that, but sea otters usually treat their researchers well, so they age gracefully. So I've known Tim for about the past decade, a little more, but the best over the past decade. And he became the leader of the U.S. Geological Survey / UC Santa Cruz Cooperative Sea Otter Research Program here about the time that I became recovery coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we've been colleagues for quite a while. So during that time, he's led collaborative and comprehensive research projects that have overturned some of our preconceived notions of what drives southern sea otter population trends, and really sea otter population trends generally. And I know he'll be telling you about some of that work. So in addition to being a friendly and generous and collaborative colleague in what's informally known as the Southern Sea Otter Research Alliance, that includes partners such as the Monterey Bay Aquarium, California Fish and Wildlife, UC Santa Cruz, UC Davis, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and others, as needed, and lots of students. In addition to being just a super friendly and collaborative and generous person with that, he's best known for his mathematical modeling prowess. And that's affectionately termed Tim's magic math machine to those of us who have benefited from it, and many people have benefited from that. So Tim produced a model that demonstrated that the southern sea otter's slow population growth, our ideas about what was causing that were just completely wrong. And so he had this model that was able to transform what was just conjecture into something that you could demonstrate to other people. And even better, that idea came to him in a dream. so I hope we'll have a chance to tell you about that too. So it's with the greatest pleasure that I introduce Dr. Tim Tinker, one of the foremost experts on sea otter biology and ecology of our time.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Thank you very much, Lillian. It's been, as always, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be able to speak to you people and to work with many of you who are in this room, who are, in fact, collaborators on a lot of this research. And one thing I want to be just very clear about right from the outset, everything that I've learned and everything that I'm going to be talking about is the result of collaboration, working with just an amazing group of people. Actually, it's an ever-evolving group of people as new generations of students come in and join, and many of you are here in this room, and many have come before. And that's so I'm going to be telling you a little bit today about some of the lessons I have learned from sea otters, and really from all those people as well, from having the honor of working with all those people. So that's, without further ado, I guess I'm going to jump right into the lessons that I have learned. And these are going to be somewhat chronological. I'm going to take you back in time about 25 years ago, when I was a younger me. I don't know about this whole aging gracefully thing. So I had just, in 1993, I had finished my master's actually studying seals out of the east coast of Canada. So I really was a seal biologist at that time, and I thought I'd take a brief diversion into sea otters because I met this fellow at a conference, Jim Estes, who offered me a job going out to the Aleutian Islands to work in a project. It sounded really exciting. We dropped off by plane and had no contact because I wrote. That's exactly the sort of thing that a 23-year-old wants to do. So I thought, I'll take a year or two, study sea otters, and then go back to studying seals again, because how long did it take to learn everything you need to know about sea otters? And that's sort of how it all began. So I'm going to start out, before I jump into the lessons, I'm going to tell you some things that I thought I knew at that time. Of course, being 23, I was pretty sure I knew everything, because every 23-year-old knows everything. I didn't, but here are some things I thought I knew. First of all, big ecosystem changes happen, but they're generally predictable and driven by really big sort of forcing drivers. Climate change, we didn't know much about that back then, although we were starting to suspect that it was important. And that's certainly the sort of large global scale thing that can drive huge changes in the ecosystem. It's doing it right now. Actually, another reason I didn't go back and study gray seals, I do lots of these little diversions. Another reason I didn't go back and study gray seals is that the pack ice that they used to breed on in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where I did my master's, is gone now. It has not existed. It's not been there for about 15 years. So another little climate change version. Overfishing obviously is a huge impact on the world's marine predators, and of course, long before overfishing, there was just devastation of the world's terrestrial predators. Those are the sorts of driving factors that I figured made big ecosystem changes. So that was one, and I also figured if you studied them hard enough, they were predictable. They were what we call deterministic. If you applied that same force to that ecosystem every time, you get pretty much the same response to the ecosystem. That was one thing I thought I knew. I thought that individuals that comprise the population were generally similar. And I was sort of coming at things from kind of a population biology approach, that populations are made up of individuals, and there's random differences between individuals, but those in general you can kind of think of a seal or a sea otter in a population. And aside from some random, small random differences, they're all going to be more or less the same. I really liked animal behavior. I've liked animal behavior from my days as a school boy, reading about Tim Bergen and all the great studies that have happened. So I thought animal behavior is really cool, but it's cool sort of from an evolutionary perspective. It isn't really necessary for understanding population dynamics, which are more driven by demography, births and deaths of individuals. I have been reading up ever since actually being offered the job by Jim, and I actually knew his research from before for doing my master's. I knew about all his sort of seminal work with sea otters in kelp forest in Alaska. So I knew sea otters were keystone predators in kelp forest ecosystems. That's where you would find sea otters, and that's where they had these really important roles that most people are aware of. I'll cover them very briefly on this. I also just, out of the blue, I thought, sea otters, monkeys, way different. They don't have a whole lot. So those are some of the things that I thought I knew as a 23-year-old. So I'm now going to step through these one by one and alluding to each, I'm going to sort of elaborate some of the lessons that I've learned from the Weasel CR here, and of course from all the people that I did that research with. So big ecosystem changes are predictable, caused by big drivers, prey abundance, such as climate change, overfishing, and things like that. First lesson, big ecosystem changes are not always predictable. And in fact, sometimes they can be caused by relatively small behavioral changes in individuals, and sometimes those behavioral changes are entirely idiosyncratic. And that's kind of disturbing. It takes away a lot of the predictability that we, as ecologists, we want systems to be predictable in some way, because otherwise we feel like we're kind of lost. So there's a lot of pushback to this idea that really big changes can sometimes happen for entirely non-predictable reasons, but they can. And I'm going to tell you about my first lesson in that. So here's where I first went to start studying sea otters. This is the Aleutian Archipelago. There's Alaska up there. The tail of Alaska stretches out this chain of islands almost all the way to Russia. The Russian Commander Islands are way out here, and then Russia would start right over here. So this is what, if yellow equals sea otters, this is what that archipelago looked like in about 1740, and prior to that, actually, stretching back into the indefinite past. Sea otters were in all the islands, as far as we know, throughout the archipelago, and of course also all the way along the Alaska Peninsula and the whole way down the Pacific coast. That changed due to the, I guess, the first culturally driven behavioral coincidence that I will mention, and that was that an expedition, a Bering expedition going across North America, happened to get waylaid by weather and had to spend a winter on Bering Island, and discovered that there were a lot of sea otters there. And sea otter fur was incredibly valuable at the time. They brought those furs back to Russia, and that initiated the fur trade, the North Pacific fur trade, that for the next about 150 years decimated sea otter populations around the North Pacific, so that by 1911, the beginning of the 20th century, when they were finally protected by international treaties, sea otters were virtually and functionally extinct from their entire range. Luckily, they weren't quite completely extinct. There were a few small little remnant colonies. In the Aleutians, this is where we think some of the remnant colonies were, based on the subsequent pattern of reintroduction. But basically, the only places there were sea otters were places where there was no good anchorages for ships, where people hadn't been able to get to them and hunt them out. And if it wasn't for those little coincidences, they probably would have been extinct. So, once they were protected by international treaties, sea otters did another thing they do quite well, which is begin to recover. They're really persistent and amazing animals that way, and once you actually start killing them in huge numbers, they're pretty good at recovering, and in all kinds of different places. So by 1970, this is what the archipelago looked like in terms of the distribution of sea otters. Around the areas where there had been remnant colonies, they'd expanded, they'd grown out. There's a lot of islands they hadn't been able to get to yet just because of geographic distance. They were actually just getting to Attu Island in 1970. But in other places like Antarctica, where one of the remnant colonies was, they'd already reached equilibrium density. So they were super abundant here, they were super abundant in a couple of other islands, they were low abundance in other islands, and they were not even existing yet in others. And that created a perfect sort of natural laboratory for comparing what was the effect of sea otters in islands with and without. With and without sea otters, how did the ecosystems look? And that led to this understanding of sea otters as being a keystone predator. Because the islands that sea otters were not at, when you could take your skiff out, drop your anchor anywhere around the island and dive down, and that's what you would see. You'd see the odd little strand of kelp. Basically, you would see rocks covered in urchins with tiny little patches of kelp in places that urchins had trouble getting to. And when you went to the islands that otters had been at for a long time, this is what you would see. You saw these rich, luxuriant kelp forests that stretched for kilometers offshore, all the way around the island. Huge and dramatic difference. And of course, all the things that lived in these kelp forests were very different than the things that lived in these urchin berries. There's still a lot of species in these, but they're different than the species that live in these kelp forests. So completely different ecosystems, and it seemed to coincide. The only thing that defined these differences was whether otters were there or not. And because of that, they were factored just reaching Attu created an opportunity to even see would Attu transition from urchin bearings to kelp. And Jim Estes, my collaborator, actually, and my mentor and former PhD advisor, began those experiments in 1970, and through 70s and 80s watched them increase at Attu, and sure enough, actually transitioned from this to this over that time period as sea otters became more abundant. So, recovery of sea otters and the Aleutians transformed the whole nearshore ecosystem from an urchin-dominated state to a kelp-dominated state. In ecology, we call these alternative stable states. They're stable because once they transition from one state to the other, they tend to remain in that state. It's hard to get them to move back to the other state. So that's the stable part. You kind of think of that like a ping pong ball at a table where there's two sort of divots. If you push it from one to the other, it's going to tend to stay in the new bowl and not want to go back to the other bowl. So that was sort of the understanding. And by the time I came on the scene in the early 1990s, and Jim was just beginning another study out here at ADAC in 1994. And the purpose of that study was to study a population that we knew to be at carrying capacity. And that means a population that had been stable for a long time and did not seem to be increasing anymore. It was at the density that island and the prey at that island seemed to support, which at ADAC was about 4,000 to 5,000 animals. So that's what we believed was going on at ADAC, and we actually wanted to do that so that we could get data to compare to California, because we wanted to see, was California at carrying capacity or not, or why was the population not growing as fast in California. So that was the goal of the study, and we set out to do the sort of things that we've done in a lot of these areas. We tagged a bunch of animals, and we followed them, looking at a whole bunch of metrics: survival, reproduction, diet, all those sorts of things. The only problem was the population didn't do what we expected. The animals didn't do what we expected. Most of the animals we tagged disappeared over the course of the first year. And that was not expected and disturbing. And not only that, the numbers of animals were declining throughout the course of the study. By 94, we knew this decline was happening in ADAC. And by 1997, the population had declined by about 80% at ADAC. So areas that there had just been hundreds of otters before were just devoid of otters. And that was the last thing that we expected. We started in 97, that triggered us to sort of start going and surveying some other islands. It hadn't been part of the initial plan, but we were wondering, is this just an ADAC thing, or is this happening in other islands? So we went to our other islands scattered across the archipelago, and sure enough, they were all doing exactly the same thing at about the same rate. And it appeared to be the same decline trajectory, happening over a huge area of the Western Aleutians. That was also not surprising. We, at that point, Fish and Wildlife Service joined in, also being very concerned. We combined skiff surveys and aerial surveys of the whole Aleutian Archipelago, from Attu right through the eastern Aleutians and even the Alaskan Peninsula. And we discovered, and this is basically what we saw, that the population over that entire area was declining from what we assumed before was almost 70% of carrying capacity across the whole area, down to about 3% of carrying capacity by the early 2000s. So one of the most dramatic wildlife declines that we've seen over a short period in the last, 50 years or so. So what was going on? And I sort of alluded to this before, that we expected for this sort of change, there must be some really big driver. Because it's not just happening in one little place, it's happening with this huge geographic area. So we thought maybe there's some massive disease, that like a virus or something that was just killing all the otters in this whole area. We had actually found high contaminants in some of the areas that we looked at. Maybe there were toxins that were causing mortality or increasing susceptibility to disease. Maybe there was some huge oceanographic change that was reducing prey. So basically, they were all starving to death. Maybe this was sort of a long shot fishing bycatch, but there really wasn't any major fishing effort there that could kill that many otters without somebody seeing or knowing that this was happening. So these are sort of some of the drivers that we were looking at. We investigated some of these actually. In fact, we did a whole contaminant study measuring contaminants in both sea otters and their prey across all these different islands. It turned out it wasn't any of those things. It was this. It was the fact that killer whales, which prior to the 1990s had not been observed hunting sea otters at all, or just there's one or two anecdotal information from the previous 50 years. And then in the early 1990s, colleagues of ours, and myself actually, at this study, began to see killer whales eating sea otters. And we initially thought that this was an amazing sort of event, sort of like being out in the Serengeti or something like that and watching a lion taking wildebeest. It was like dramatic, it was incredible. Like, wow, this killer whale comes out and just scarfs down an otter and scarfs down another. But we didn't think it was, that important. It was more like a really cool anecdote, but not something that we thought was going to be driving a population change. Well, how could it? Why would it? It began to occur to us, though, that in fact this actually might be what was going on. We actually, as we were surveying with other islands, we actually saw killer whales also eating otters at those other islands as well. Not a ton, I mean, just really about a dozen observations, although they've continued over time, and there's more observations now. At that time, there was only about a dozen direct observations, so we thought, so how is something so rare that, you know, that only a few people have seen because they decline of this magnitude? Well, we said, here's our lines of evidence. Observed attacks started in the early 1990s, about the same time that the population began. We actually did some honor studies based on the number of hours that we'd spent at all these islands, the number of attacks we'd actually seen, and then just sort of assuming that those were just random observations, we actually just multiplied that occurrence rate across, and lo and behold, that number was actually consistent with the number of otter deaths that would have been required to cause that rate of decline. So just because something happens early does not mean that it's not important. Interesting, at various habitats that killer whales couldn't get into, mostly these were lagoons with shallow entrances that otters were in, the decline did not happen there. In fact, some of those areas even increased in presence. There were no carcasses or no sick animals as we were doing these studies as well. Unlike previous studies where when there had been disease-caused mortality, we find tons of carcasses. Because the otters get sick, they wash on the beach. Here we're finding 0 carcasses. And all the animals we were captured were incredibly healthy. In fact, they were getting healthier. The body condition of animals was increasing over the course of the decline, which made the food thing very likely. Yeah, the remaining otters that were there are in excellent condition. And finally, we started, actually by 2000, we started to see a change in sea otter behavior and distribution. Predator avoidance behavior, basically. Otters no longer were out in kelp. Well, there weren't many kelp bases, I'll tell you in a minute, but they weren't very offshore at all. In fact, they were glued to the shore, like a meter or so from shore, and they would rest over top of rocks, which we discovered when we tried to capture them. And when any disturbance happened, they would immediately jump out onto the rocks. So they started exhibiting behavior we've never seen before that was consistent with the fact that they were learning to avoid killer whale predation. So that, I mean, based on this and other pieces of evidence, we're quite certain at this point that this was in fact the driver of that decline. And that's not the most important lesson that I learned from this, actually. The most important lesson was that this whole phenomenon was probably driven by behavioral innovation by a few killer whales, possibly even one female. Killer whale societies are matrilineal, and whales that will usually be older females basically teach younger ones how to hunt. And a lot of their hunting behavior and a variety of aspects of the behavior and language are spread through cultural transmission through killer whale societies. And we think this began with probably one pod of killer whales, a couple of females that developed this new behavioral innovation and spread through cultural transmission. And not necessarily into the whole population. It wouldn't even have taken, it required all the whales to be doing it. Just a relatively small number of whales that have driven this whole decline. And that's what was amazing to me, was this question often would come up, well, if killer whales do this, eat otters out there, why aren't they eating otters in southeast Alaska, or in California, or anywhere else? And the answer is actually, there's not a deterministic thing. We just didn't happen to have discovered that. And we think in the Aleutians, the reason there was pressure for them to expand their diets was that the pinniped populations had decreased. But nonetheless, what eventually triggered this whole thing was just this completely unpredictable behavioral innovation spread by culture. And that's the part that is humbling, that there are certain things that will happen that nobody is going to be able to predict. The best we can do is to understand them and try to adapt to the situation. So what did this new behavioral innovation, what sorts of changes did it drive? Well, killer whales were very effectively reduced the abundance of sea otters. With sea otters reduced by about 90% throughout that whole area, urchins proliferated, reducing the amount of kelp in the entire coastline for over 1,000 miles from Attu right to the Aleutian Peninsula, transition from this back to this. If you can go to any island you want and go and just throw your anchor over and dive down at an island, and that's what we're going to see again. So it's the change from this one tiny behavioral innovation is huge. So there's lesson number one. So individuals that comprise the population are generally similar to each other, minus some minor differences. So lesson two that I learned from sea otters, this lesson actually involved, I began to learn, I'd heard some stories while I was up in the Aleutians, before I even met people like Michelle, who's here tonight. who was working with sea otters down here in California, but I heard that some of the work she was doing with colleagues had suggested that sea otters had really different diets down there. I was quite intrigued by that. Like, why would animals in the same time and place have different diets, which should all be optimal foraging? So this was a lesson that we had to travel down to California to explore. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown on the idea of how we expect diet to change in predators as a function of their population status. And by the population status, I largely mean the relative abundance. When predators are low density or just being introduced to a new habitat, they often they'll tend to the optimal foragers will tend to focus on whatever is the most energetically profitable prey. Especially predators like sea otters that are energy limited. So they're going to go for the type of prey that's going to give them the most calories per unit time. And they'll all tend to do the same thing. As predator populations grow in density, especially predators like sea otters, that are at the top of the food of their own respective food webs and can reduce the abundance of the prey that they're eating, they actually reduce the abundance of these preferred prey. And as a result, you start to see an increase in the dietary niche. The population diet becomes more diverse. More and more smaller and less profitable prey get added to the diet over time. And eventually, once you have a population of equilibrium, you expect to see a really diverse diet. And this pattern has been studied and repeated over a lot of different populations of animals. We expect to see the same thing with sea otters. Greater diet diversity is expected in populations where food abundance is low and the population is at or near the carrying capacity of the environment. So a really cool thing about sea otters, as a lot of you know, is that they live very close to shore. They eat all their food lying on their backs, and they eat their food like this. And so if you are on the shore, or even in a boat, with a nice high-powered telescope, this is what you see in the telescope. You're able to actually see everything that they're eating. So there's not many other carnivores that you can do that. Carnivores are sort of famously very secretive. But sea otters are one of the only predators, only top carnivores where we can actually directly observe their diet. And that's really cool. But we worry sometimes that they might be doing different things at night, or maybe they're doing different things when we're not seeing them. So some new tools have been added over time. One of them is something called stable isotope analysis. When we capture sea otters, we take one of their whiskers, which is a little neat, but they're regrowing these whiskers all the time. And we take those whiskers and we section them into little pieces, and we send them off to a friend of ours, Seth, who runs them through a cool machine and basically can see what the diet of the otter is through the principle of you are what you eat. Basically, when you eat, there's certain compounds that have particular isotopes, and the isotopes we're interested in are isotopes of carbon and nitrogen that don't get used by our bodies very well, so they're stable over time. And by looking at the relative ratios of those isotopes, those particular molecules in the whiskers, you get an idea of what the diet was that otter was doing, because what that otter was eating when it was making that whisker. And because whiskers are only live here at the follicle and they grow out like that, out here they're inert, you actually, by sectioning the whisker up, you actually get about 1.5 years of time in that otter's life of what it ate over 1.5 years. That means that we can compare an otter's diet over 1.5 years with another otter's diet over the last 1.5 years in the same population. The good news is that the isotopic data that they're getting from the whiskers pretty much confirmed what we'd already been seeing from the observation data, which made us feel good. So we went out and we actually did a study, and this is actually the study that we were doing when Jenna joined in and became part of her master's project. We were studying the diet of a population that was at high density, and we wanted to compare that to a population that was low density and see if this prediction about diet diversity held up. So here's the diet, and this is basically a histogram. These are sort of the main categories of prey, like kelp crab, cancer crab, clam, snail, and on like this, through. And the same category over here, San Nicolas. And the height of these bars tells you how abundant those prey are in the diet. So this is basically a diverse diet. You see it sort of spread out over a lot of different prey. And this is a non-diverse diet. It's dominated by one prey type, which happens to be urchins. So this was pretty much exactly what we expected. In the low-density place, San Nicolas Island, where they hadn't been for as long, there were low densities, urchins were still really abundant, and those were the preferred prey. They had high energy, so these otters were basically having a heyday. They were big, fat, happy otters eating tons of urchins. And in the mainland, they were kind of skinny, scrawny otters that were having to eat lots and lots of really little things. So that matched pretty much what we were expecting. No lesson learned there. When we looked at the diets of individual animals, because again, we tag these individual otters so we can follow them over many years. We saw that at San Nicolas Island, every diet was just about the same. They were all dominated by urchins and the same sort of number 2 prey. But when we look at the diets of individuals in the high-density population, they didn't all look the same. Even though the population diet was sort of gradual and diverse over all these different prey, individuals actually had, their diets were just as specialized as at San Nicolas, it's just that they were specializing in different things. And so when you averaged over all these different individuals, you got a generalized diet. But if you look at any one individual, it was actually being just as specialized as at San Nicolas, but they were specializing in different things. So, and these were not, initially thought it was maybe these were just driven by, older ones eat one thing, or younger ones eat another thing, males and females eat different things, but it turned out that was not the explanation. Individual females, like adult females of the same age, that had the exact same home range, nonetheless, they were having these different diets. Some were snail specialists, some were crab or abalone specialists, some were clam and worm specialists. So that was really quite intriguing and sort of kicked off a lot of research. So to summarize, when otter density is low and the preferred prey are abundant, all otters tend to have similar diets. And when otters are at high density and food is scarce, diets tend to vary between individual otters. So that's really cool, but why does it matter? I mean, other than just being sort of a behavioral oddity, that otters are these dietary specialists, is it actually important? And we think it is important in a lot of ways. It's certainly important from the perspective of evolution of different species. This might be how, for instance, this type of specialization could actually lead to speciation over the long term. But we actually think it's important for some more immediate reasons as well. For one thing, it turns out different diet specializations are going to expose individuals to different environmental stressors that they're getting through their prey. And with sea otters, which eat a lot of prey in this nearshore zone right adjacent to the coastline, they get a lot of stressors, environmental stressors through their prey. Any contaminants, disease-causing pathogens, they're getting all these things through the invertebrates that they're eating. And because different invertebrates that they're eating have different life histories and are different likelihoods of picking up, for instance, toxins or parasites from the environment, we would expect, in fact, that otters with different specializations of different invertebrates are going to be exposed to different things. So right after we sort of discovered this dietary specialization, we were already working with some collaborators at UC Davis who are interested in disease. And at Department of Fish and Wildlife just down the road here. So we were trying to analyze why diseases occur in some areas, not others. Basically, how are animals getting these disease-causing parasites that we believe were originating from land? So we were throwing all these different variables in a big analysis, and we just discovered this dietary specialization, and we thought, well, they had to throw that in there as well. And interestingly, it turned out that actually explained more variation in the whether otters had disease or not than anything else that we looked at. Basically, you could pretty much predict which diseases animals were going to have by their dietary specialization. And they weren't even the ones that we were expecting. So we were thinking pretty much anyone that eats lots of mussels is going to have all the diseases, and everybody else, all the other otters should be fine. It wasn't that way at all, actually. Turbid snails, the last thing we would have expected, turned out to be the best predictor of whether or not you had Toxoplasma gondii or not, whether you had that infection. And that is a correlation that's held up over the last 15 years. We've repeated this analysis, actually. In different areas, we found the exact same results. So we kept doing it because we just couldn't believe the results we were getting. But when you keep getting the same results over and over again, you eventually believe them. So that's a fascinating thing. And it was different for different diseases. So for Sarcoidosis cinerona, actually turned out that specializing in clams and fat innkeeper worms, particular animals that live in this area around Cannery Row, had the highest risk by far of infection with Sarcoidosis cinerona. And then there's another hot spot down by Morro Bay for animals eating razor clams. So this is sort of just opening up this realization that knowing what animals are specializing on can actually help us discover how these parasites and pathogens are getting from land into the ocean, into the food webs that otters are eating. The otters' diets are essentially a clue that we can follow to figure out these problems that are otherwise really intractable. You can't actually detect either of these parasites in the environment. Even if we got 1 million gallons of seawater in a test, you wouldn't find a single parasite. They're just too diluted. So before this realization, we didn't have any way of tracking those parasites through the environment, but now otters are giving us this way through their dietary specialization. Another reason that we think specialization matters, or another example of why it matters, is something that's going on right now. This is a study that we're conducting with collaboration with Monterey Aquarium, UC Santa Cruz, so Dr. Mark Carr at this university and his team, and the usual sets of collaborators are conducting a study at Monterey right now, and some of you may have heard about this or even seen a little bit of this if you ever go out snorkeling in that area. This is something that has not been seen around the peninsula for basically since sea otters returned, and yet it's happening right now. There's huge areas of urchin barrens, and they're spreading actually. They're still increasing in extent. So they're coming like around Otter Point, Lover's Point, all of that area. They're actually closing in on Cannery Road right now. So this was quite fascinating, and it was not something that we ever expected to see in a place where sea otters were abundant. Again, because of our dogma. If urchins are abundant, we thought all otters would just switch to eating urchins and clean them out, so they'd take care of things for us. And yet that didn't seem to be happening. So we're trying to understand why. Well, we're trying to understand why this is happening in the first place, and also why otters are not reducing the abundance of urchins as fast as we think they should be. And one of the answers to this might lie in specialization. That is to say, so otters who already were specializing in urchins have things really good. They have tons of urchins. And we're also seeing an increase right now in the frequency of urchin specialists. So probably some of the young ones entering the population are learning or specializing. So we're seeing a higher frequency of urchin specialists. But all the other animals who are specializing in other prey are still eating those other prey. So the population is not doing what we expected. They're maintaining their specialization, what they're really good at. And that is, again, something you'll notice the theme here. There's always things that we're not expecting, and that's one of the great. This is why you get into ecology, because it's so fun to discover things that you're not expecting. So this is really sort of ongoing right now. We don't yet know how this is going to play out, but we're having a lot of fun watching it. Okay, so behavior is interesting, sure, but it's not relevant for understanding the population dynamics. For that, you just need a whole bunch of numbers. And as Lillian told me, I love doing great, population models that can explain population dynamics with nothing more than numbers and matrices. Otters taught me in another lesson, lesson 3, yes. Understanding behavior is critical for understanding population dynamics. And this is going to sort of follow on from what I was just telling you about individual specialization with sea otters. Another implication of sea otters having this extreme level of specialization, particularly females, and both males and females do specialize, but females tend to specialize more. Territorial males also specialize, but some of those non-territorial males, they're more generalists, and they can move around the population. Females basically get really good at what they do, and that kind of locks them in both to a prey and to an area. They have to know their environment incredibly well. And so probably related to that strong specialization is the fact that females have this incredibly high site fidelity and habitat selection. This is what you're seeing here is about there's 10 kilometers there, so that's about 15 kilometers of coastline around the point. And this is sort of the lifetime home range for one female. She moves back and forth between these two kelp, and these are both kelp beds, basically. And in between there's no kelp, and she can't use that area. So she just moves back and forth here. She's perfectly capable of swimming hundreds of kilometers. And in fact, the males who might be right here do that. They swim hundreds of kilometers. But she doesn't. Year after year, she's going to just use the same area. And that was something that we really didn't know until we started developing tags and radio tags that were good enough that we could actually follow them for basically their entire adult lives and discover that once they've sort of developed a specialization and a home range, that's basically where they're going to be for the rest of their lives. And that turns out to be really important for a whole bunch of different reasons. So home ranges of individual females are very small. That means that they're exposed to the conditions that they're exposed to in terms of both environmental stressors and prey abundance are highly local. So there could be incredibly abundant prey up here, but that won't help this female at all. And there could be incredibly abundant prey down here, and that won't help this female at all, because that's where she's spending her entire life. And probably her daughters will also spend their entire lives either here or close to here. So that means that there's a lot of actual sort of hidden structure in the population. And it also means that the things that regulate population abundance, whether they're occasional big diseases that happen or environmental contaminants or prey abundance, operate at a small spatial scale. They operate locally. So the prey abundance in this area is what's going to determine how abundant the population can be here. So before this, we were kind of thinking of carrying capacity at the scale of the whole population. We would talk about what is the carrying capacity for southern sea otters. And we assured ourselves they couldn't be a carrying capacity yet because there's all this unoccupied habitat, so they must be well below carrying capacity. And the problem was we're thinking of things at the wrong scale. Around Monterey Peninsula, or in Big Sur, where they've been for the longest, they were at carrying capacity, and they've been at carrying capacity for quite some time now. Whereas at the edges of the range, where they're still expanding, they're well below carrying capacity. So we had this scale problem in terms of how we're thinking of how the population is regulated. So when we put these things together, this limited female dispersal, the fact that they just don't go very far, local population regulation, this actually predicts a very slow rate of population recovery along California's coastline, which is a very narrow one-dimensional strip. And I'm going to sort of give you an example of why that really matters. So I wanted to compare the recovery of sea otters in California to southeast Alaska. So California, as we just finished saying, its features is this long, narrow, one-dimensional strip of habitat stretching along the coast, just like a thread, basically. And sea otters have only two ways they can expand. They can go south, they can go north. There's nowhere else to go. They're not going to go inland, and they can't go offshore. Compare that with southeast Alaska, or really any of the northern habitats, which look a lot more like this. They're basically these huge, extensive archipelagos with bays and channels and islands, literally stretching sometimes tens or hundreds of kilometers from side to side, as well as up and down. So basically, in these areas, sea otters are actually were introduced here by translocation as a recovery effort to a number of different points along here. And each one of those little translocated populations expanded in all directions. So it's not a one-dimensional strip, it's a two-dimensional matrix. So once we sort of began to sort of mull all this around in our minds, this local population regulation, we began to think, as Lillian suggested, what triggered this was actually a very elaborate dream I once had, which I can tell you about later. It's a long story. It involves a very good friend, a dear friend of all of ours, Jack Ames, who's probably the longest studying sea otter person. And in my dream, he was berating me about this and telling me about a model that he'd written years ago, and that why wouldn't I ever read this paper? It's an unrealistic dream. And even then, he skipped in my dream, he laid out the whole model and the equations and everything. And I woke up, and I said, wow. And then I was so intrigued, I went in and I wrote down all the models, and that's what I did. So basically, landscape topology, and in conjunction with topology, I mean just how the habitat is configured in space, in conjunction with individual behavior of sea otters, actually turned out to be really important in affecting the possible rate of recovery. It just has to do with how a population diffuses over space. And diffusion is essentially, you might think of that as like if you drop a bunch of drops of ink into a clear glass of water, it's going to diffuse into that glass of water. That's molecules moving, and it turns out that animal populations, you can describe them using the same types of models. So if you take a population and you introduce it at the same density on time zero, and you give it the exact same demographic rates of survival, birth rates, equilibrium densities at any one point in space, and movement behavior, and you set that model running, and if you set it running in a one-dimensional habitat, actually exactly the California habitat, this is what the model predicts. And when you set that same model running in southeast Alaska from those points, this is what the model predicts. And so these lines are the model predictions, the points are the actual survey points. So for years we've been sort of trying to understand why the California population was growing so much more slowly than the northern populations. And we had basically had all these different theories from genetic inbreeding to more diseases, to more contaminants, to more everything. But it had always been puzzling is when we actually looked at any one population in any one place, the otters had the same survival rates as they did in Alaska, they had the same birth rates. Everything seemed to be the same. So none of those other explanations seemed to really make sense. And yet when we ran these models, it suddenly did make sense. But basically we've just been thinking about it in the wrong way. So these differences between these two trajectories don't arise from any differences in the otters themselves. They simply arise from differences in how the population diffuses in a one-dimensional matrix versus a two-dimensional matrix. And again, it requires that there be strong site fidelity and local population regulation, which there is. So that was a really huge lesson that sea otters taught us, and that we were not expecting at all. So as you see, we're pretty much wrong with everything. So So sea otters, well, here's one thing we know already, right? Sea otters are keystone predators of kelp species. I showed you that example already. So that's something we can all feel confident about. But as a little wise guy, it's always up there with a new lesson. So sea otters actually have strong ecological effects, he or she says. Is that she, Michelle, or it's a she. She says, smart aleck. They actually have strong effects in a variety of different coastal habitats. And this is something we've kind of known to some degree, but we hadn't really fully learned this lesson until this happened. This is Aleutian Slough, as most of you know, or you might not recognize it from this particular angle. So sea otters colonized Aleutian Slough initially in the mid-1980s, but they didn't really start colonizing in earnest until the 1990s. In fact, here's a population trajectory of surveys. So there was a group, first one in there in the mid-1980s, but not many animals, they didn't all stay. In fact, most of them didn't stay. And then again, in the mid-90s, they really started increasing. These were all, there was a sort of initial peak, went down again, and then they started increasing really in earnest, and this is actually when reproduction began. This is an intrinsically growing population, growing from, not just from immigration, but actually from births and deaths rates within the slough. So here we have this really nice example of an increasing population and increasingly pretty high numbers, like up over 100 animals in this relatively confined area of the slough. So another perfect little laboratory to see what sort of effects we're going to have. So through a huge collaborative effort with, again, the usual cast of characters and many people who are in this room right now, I actually know, there have actually been a number of different separate studies that I'm going to sort of wrap into one. We started sort of looking in earnest at this population and at the potential ecological effects they may have within the slough. So, like the same metadata that you can see before, we can study their diets, we can study their habitat use, their home ranges. We can also do studies in the environment to see how other species are responding. So, let's look at the diets first, because I love diets. So, sea otter diets. During the early years of early part of that increasing abundance, their diets were largely dominated by crabs, cancer crabs, like this guy here. Big red crabs and rock crabs. They had cancer acnarius and cancer productus. And there were plenty of these in the slough before otters got in there, really big ones. Super abundant, and that's because those super abundant crabs, although there were a few things that ate the crabs, they basically didn't really have a major apex predator above them. So these big crabs, big daddies, were in fact, they were the top predators, and they were eating everything else. That, of course, changes when otters enter the equation. They can eat just about everything. And they went for the most energetically abundant thing that was there, and there are no urchins in the slough, so that was the crabs. And they actually depleted the abundance of these big crabs dramatically. In fact, at this point, you pretty much will never not find a crab that's I don't think you're going to find one that size anywhere in the slough anymore. It turned out that these guys were having a big impact on a lot of other smaller invertebrates, including these types of grazers. These are sea hares, and they graze along the seagrass. But it actually turns out they're not so much grazing the seagrass itself, they're grazing the algae that grows on the seagrass. So once otters have removed pretty much all of these big crabs, there's no longer the strong pressure, top-down pressure of crabs on the sea hare. They increase in abundance, as did other herbivores like Idatea, isopods that also do the same thing. And with more grazers, they graze the algae off the seagrass, and it started getting a lot more healthy and a lot more abundant. In fact, seagrass beds, which have been declining for a long time because of beautification, stopped declining and actually reversed and started increasing in their abundance again. If you go to the slough now, you will see much bigger seagrass beds than were there 20 years ago. So, why is that important? Well, seagrass beds, turns out, are really ecologically important. They're nursery habitat for a whole bunch of invertebrates and fish, including a lot of fish that people like to eat. It's also turns out it's a carbon sink, so it actually reduces the potential climate change because it's fixing carbon, and then those seagrass then get trapped in sediments, and so trap that carbon, so it's no longer up in the atmosphere. So this is like a great service that otters are providing for free. But of course, at this point now, they sort of, their job is done, right? They've taken care of all those big crabs. But no, of course, as we already said, we've talked about already, otter diets adapt and change as the environment changes. So this is what a diet looks like now. A lot more clams diet, no cancer crab fact, they're pretty much gone. But they're now eating a lot of these small short crabs, which aren't nearly as energetically profitable as the big crabs. They're just about this big. But they are super abundant. So that's what these guys here, pachygraphs, is a short crab. And if you go on the slough in a kayak or a boat, and you look in the bank, you're going to see all these little tunnels, and you'll even hear them. That sound. That's these guys chomping away on the roots of the vegetation along the banks. So they were so abundant here that they tend to be destabilizing the banks by making all these tunnels in the banks that will collapse into the slough. Okay, so usual. This is another but different sea otter trophic cascade, is what we call these. Without otters present, we have lots and lots of these little short crabs, and this is what the salt marsh looks like. So the salt marshes, I should take a step back. The eelgrass is actually in the channel. It's sort of most in the water except for low tide. Salt marsh is what you see on either side of the main channel. That stretches on and on. It's all covered in pickleweed, and there's little tidal creeks weaving in and amongst it, so you can take your kayak right up there and look at all this pickleweed. And this is what the pickleweed looks like when there's lots and lots of short crabs. It's just sort of perforated with all their holes, and often doesn't look very healthy at all. At otters, they eat a whole bunch of these guys, reduce their abundance a lot. And this is actually what the salt marsh looks like when otters are present. In the tidal creeks that otters are using, you have much healthier salt marshes. The pickleweed basically is much happier because it's not full of holes. Turns out there's also a lot more below ground biomass as well, because the crabs aren't eating it. So why is that important? Well, it turns out salt marsh is also an important habitat for a lot of animals, invertebrates, birds, and it also helps stabilize the banks from erosion and reduce bank erosion. And that's really important with rising seawater. So this is another really important habitat that sea otters seem to benefit just by doing what sea otters do, which is eating a lot. Okay, so this kind of changes our whole paradigm. And up to now, we've really focused on the idea of sea otters as a keystone predator in this sort of habitat, rocky subtidal ecosystems along the Arctic coast. And they do, in fact, obviously have really important functions in those ecosystems. It turns out they also contribute important ecosystem services in estuaries as well. And there's a lot of other habitats that we haven't really studied sea otters in. Why haven't we studied sea otters in those habitats? Because they haven't got there yet. You have to remember that sea otters were gone a century ago, and they're still increasing. And it turns out that probably a lot of the reason that we have this concept in our head as sea otters as sort of apex predators of the outer coast that you find in kelp forests is really just historical accident. It happens to be that this is where they were left in California, and actually the same sort of historical accident applies to the north as well. The areas that otters persisted in these little remnant colonies were often these remote outer coast areas. There were no harbors for the ships and the fur traders, so that's where they happened to be left. And so they've been increasing along this outer coast. And if the only remnant colony had been somewhere like San Francisco Bay, we wouldn't think of otters as an outer coast animal. We'd think of them as an estuarine predator. But so a lot of our sort of conceptualization of what a sea otter is just this result of this historical accident. And that accident, of course, is now, well, that things are changing, and one of the first important changes was that sea otter population finally reached the first big estuary, which is Elkhorn Slough. And through, again, the work of a lot of people who are in this room who've been working there for years, really helped change our understanding of what a sea otter could be. It can be an outer coast predator, but it can also be this totally different predator that you see in an estuary doing different things. That's still really important. And why is this important? Even more important now because the population hopefully will keep spreading north and south, although it's been actually kind of halted in the last 10 or more years for reasons that I can talk about later. If anyone's interested. And so, but if they do keep expanding, there's a lot of estuaries in Southern California, there's a lot of estuaries in Northern California, including a huge complex of estuaries, San Francisco Bay. And this is all potential habitat that sea otters could be in and could be having these same important ecological effects. So for instance, we did a little exercise. We took the exact same type of habitat we see in Elkhorn Slough, based on depth, distance, eelgrass beds, and a variety of other things. And we just ran the GIS model to find the exact same types of habitat in San Francisco Bay. And if you apply just if you just take the density in Elkhorn Slough, divide it in half just to be conservative, and you apply that density just to this habitat, and we're excluding all the other habitat up here, which unlimited to this area of the bay, that would hold over 2,000 sea otters. And it wouldn't be, you could realize, if you add tidal peaks to this, it would be up around 5,000 sea otters. So much more than the entire current population of sea otters in California could actually be occurring just within this one estuary complex of San Francisco Bay. And in fact, historical records from the fur trade suggest that's about what was there. Because hundreds or thousands of otter whelps were taken out from this area. So that's what was in there. You know, if you came 200 years ago, San Francisco Bay would have been a very different place. So, another lesson. Okay, this is one I'm sure I'm going to hear. Sea otters and monkeys, nothing in common, right? Sea otters are sea otter, monkeys are monkey. Of course. And our little smart aleck otter here says, turns out sea otters and coastal long-tailed macaques, which are monkeys, have many important similarities. Okay, I gotta see this. Okay, so both macaques and sea otters, turns out, are both tool users. Not all sea otters are tool users, and not all macaques are tool users. Long-tailed macaques in Southeast Asia that live on small islands with, where there's, particularly the smaller islands where there's a lot of coastline but not much vegetation inland. Most of their diet turns out to be marine. And in fact, their diets look not so different than what a sea otter is eating. It consists of a lot of macroinvertebrates, including a lot of large mollusks. And it turns out, just like sea otters, macaques use rocks as either hammers or anvils. More usually they use them as hammers to crack open the large mollusks and eat them. And what do sea otters do? Pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to now actually look a little bit, if we look a little bit more closely at what causes variation in tool use in sea otters. Not all sea otters do use tools. In fact, we used to think that only southern sea otters use tools. That turned out not to be correct. We do use tools in all the northern populations. Every population we look at uses tools. But the amount of tool use depends on how much of certain prey types are in their diets. So we, using, again, our convenient little diet specialization phenomenon here in California, we look at tool use frequency with different types of specialists. So this is more frequency histograms here. This is just showing you the frequency of tool use for prey, and then this is just showing you numbers of animals that use tool use at that frequency. So this means that for cancer crab specialists, almost all individuals use tools either not at all or just very occasionally, like 1% of the time. If we look at clam and worm specialists, similar sort of thing. Most individuals who are clam and worm specialists don't use tools at all. If you look at urchin mussel specialists, pretty much the same thing. Again, there's a few individuals who will use tools a little bit more. It depends on what other prey they're eating, of course. But for most of the time, they're not using tools at all. We now look at snail specialists, totally different picture. It looks like for most individuals, they're using tools, most individuals who are snail specialists are using tools 80 to 90, or in a few cases 100% of the time. 100% of the dives that they make to bring up prey, they're using a tool. So really, when you're thinking of a tool-using sea otter, what you're really thinking of is a snail specialist. And it turns out the same phenomenon exists in the northern populations as well. The reason we didn't think they used to use tools up there is that snails are just not as common in the diet. But when you actually go and see them using snails up there, they're using tools. So that's actually also another similarity with macaques. It turns out the ecological context for tool use is really similar between sea otters and macaques. In both cases, Rosser uses hammers and anvils to crack these really hard-shelled mollusks, often marine snails, but big limpets, a lot of mollusks that have really thick shells. And the thing about those thick shells, the reason they have those thick shells in the first place, of course, is to stop things from eating. And then usually that's pretty successful. Most fish cannot get into a snail. Just that shell, and if you think fish are going to beat, I dare you to go out, and Chris, are you in the audience? I thought you were there. Yeah, so go out, find a turban snail, and you're going to feel really mean. Try and just crush it between your fingers. Don't worry, you won't be able to. They're really, really hard. So it turns out that if you're just trying to bite it, and this is, I asked both Chris's here, because this is Chris's research for his PhD. He's been looking at actually the force needed to open up different types of prey. And to open up a snail turns out to be really, really hard unless you have massive, massive jaws. And of course, even if you did, you'd risk cracking the teeth. But if you figure out how to use tools, you now have access to all of that snail biomass. And snails actually kind of be a lot of the biomass that's around these shallow areas is snail. It's all wrapped up in snails. There's just billions of them out there. So once you've figured out, you've cracked this whole thing, the tool thing, suddenly you have super abundant prey available. So there's really strong selection for tools for these two different animals, and it turns out they use tools in largely the same way. So in otters, we do see that, in fact, as I just showed you, is related to diet specialization. We're not yet sure about monkeys because we don't know how, they haven't really been tagged yet. We don't know how much individual specialization is going on, but we're collaborating with people who look at these things, and we hope to answer some of those questions in the future. So that's it. Conclusions. We've learned a whole bunch of things from studying sea otters for a long time. That's pretty much the only real conclusion that... Okay, I have another one. I think more importantly, the main lesson I've taken away actually is that the very best way to do science is collaboratively. Obviously, there's no way I could have done 100 of those things if I was just determined to go and do everything myself. Right? I actually couldn't have done any of those things. But by working with really talented, smart, creative people that you actually like being with and going into the field with, that's how you do science, and that's how we learn things. So that's actually the lesson, the main lesson I'm taking away. And with that, I'll say thank you to my teachers, the people in the Otter kind. And there are so many others that I thought I'd start putting basic pictures down, and I realized it would be like 1,000 pictures. So these are some of the key folks, but there's many, many others. With that, I'll take any questions.
Lots of questions.
Maybe put the lights on. I can see who's asking difficult questions. Yeah, just start hitting buttons. Hit the switch. If you hit those switches, they're really big ones. There you go. Awesome. Thanks. First question.
Do Alaskan otters use some resources that our otters don't, like fish or things like that?
Fish.
Can you comment on, is that bird behavior? And can you comment on San Nicolas Island? What's going on there? Or not?
I chose not to. It's funny because that's been much of my mind lately. I've been doing a lot of analysis with San Nicolas Island, but there were just so many lessons I couldn't include them all. The fish so yes, there are resources that they use differently in Alaska. Obviously, there's completely different clam fauna up there than is down here. A lot of the same clam, but also a lot of different species that they use. I would say probably the most distinguishing difference between southern and northern would be the presence of fish in the night, although that is primarily southwest Alaska. We don't see it very much in southeast Alaska or British Columbia. But from the Alaskan Peninsula, west of the Aleutians, and in the Commander Islands, fish make up anywhere from 5 to 10% of the diet. So still not like a majority of the diet, but they will eat fish. They'll eat sculpin, greenling. I've seen them eat cod before sometimes when they're really lucky, salmon occasionally. But it's mostly small things, I know a variety of different types of soils, so real flatfish. A lot of the nest garden fish, things like greenling that actually are very territorial and they tend to guard the nest and they're actually raising it. Almost all those same fish occur down here and occur in southeast Alaska and British Columbia. So why don't otters do it here? I cannot tell you. I have to assume it's some sort of cultural or learned behavior. But certainly they have the same anatomy. They're feeding in the same areas. They're all in the kelp beds. So they certainly encounter those same fish, rockfish actually as well. They're encountering those, but they just don't do it here. And they do it there. So it's one of those, it's another mystery for another generation to figure out. San Nicolas Island is a really cool place. The population continues to grow out there. It's just getting to the point now where we expect it to have some effects on subtidal ecosystems. And we think we're seeing that in some of the west end of the island where otters spend almost all the time. The same sort of high site fidelity applies as in the mainland. Even though they can go all around the island, they spend almost all their time around just a few west end sites. And that's where we've certainly seen a huge decrease in urchins and an increase in some of the lower story kelps. But the problem is there's so many other factors happening out there, including urchin disease. So there's these booms and busts of urchins. So the signal is not yet as clear. We will see, I think the next 10 years will help us understand how otters affect Southern California kelp forest ecosystems. It might be different than the way they affect them up here. But that experiment is still running.
Would you say that's a successful relocation? Is that a stable growing population?
It's a stable growing population. I'm not using successful in any sort of legal term, and the reason I say this is that this is an issue that gets into management and legalities that I am not well versed in. I'm an ecologist, not a manager, but I do know that there are terms that include success and non-success that have very specific definitions, and I'm not using it in that term. So I can't speak to what those criteria mean, but I can say that ecologically speaking, that population is growing and seems to be doing well. It's a lot less than we thought it was going to be at this point, but it is growing. Yeah.
Is Santa Cruz Island a natural population, or is it a colony transplant?
Santa Cruz Island?
Yeah, that island population.
So you mean San Nicolas Island?
San Nicolas Island.
Yeah, okay, I was going to say, if they're at Santa Cruz Island, I got to get out there right now. San Nicolas Island was a translocation. That was a management action conducted in the late 1980s, and the rationale behind that was at the time when they were developing the recovery plan was to have essentially a geographically distinct subpopulation of sea otters that in the event of a catastrophic oil spill, which that was, things like Exxon, these were in people's minds back then, that could easily cover the entire mainland range of the sea otter, and literally felt into the entire population. They wanted to have a separate, geographically separate. So that was sort of the rationale behind that, and it was established by translocating animals out there in the 1980s. Most of them left. It almost went down to nothing, but the few that stayed have started increasing in the 90s, and that's the population that.
Is there any contemplation of doing that at other sites, like in the San Francisco Bay?
Not at the moment, no. No. That's, translocation is probably not going to be in the tool chest, at least in the near future. But yeah, so not at the moment. There may be, what we're of course hoping is that they will naturally do that. But yeah, in the next few years we'll be using that. Yeah.
Are the San Nicolas Island sea otters tagged?
At this point in time, they were. We tagged them in the early 2000s, 2003 to 2005. We conducted a study out there. Are there any tagged ones still? Who's been out there most recently? I don't think so. Yeah, the last tag one's not been seen for a couple of years, so yeah, so no. We think they're all new ones now, like ones that weren't born in 2003.
So when you're reaching maximum density criteria, are you seeing great increases in additional predators, or what's happening by that?
Yes. Yeah. So basically, like, this will perhaps seem self-evident, but it's worth saying nonetheless. When a population reaches carrying capacity, there's no magic to that. All it just means is when births and deaths exactly cancel each other out, the population no longer grows. So when a population is growing, it means there's more animals being born than are dying at any one point in time, and that's generally because resources are sufficiently abundant that enough animals that are born live a long enough time that that's the case. As that reduces in time, eventually they will sort of exactly cross each other out, and that's when the population stops growing. We used to have a concept that largely came from studying populations in Alaska, that was almost entirely driven by mortality in juveniles. So, and that was particularly in Alaska, places where there's really harsh winters. At the end of the winter, there would be really high juvenile mortality. And so our concept of carrying capacity was it would happen when enough juveniles were dying, basically. And the mortality rates for adult females, for instance, would hardly vary at all between a growing population and a stable population. That turns out not to be the case at all down here. As with many things, that model doesn't seem to work at all. Juvenile mortality does go up as resources decline, but so does adult mortality, in particular reproductive females. And that's because they are so energetically stressed. Raising a pup is an unbelievably costly thing for a female to do. It doubles her energy demands. About 100% increase in her energy demands by the time the pup is large for her daily demands. And because she can't actually make that, she's actually in an energy deficit and losing weight that whole time. So what we tend to see down here at carrying capacity is a lot more female mortality. It happens right around, we call it end lactation syndrome, so right at near the end of that pup dependency period. You'll see females, you often see them hauled in, looking really skinny and hauled out in the rock, and they're basically trying to make it through. And they often do. By just hauling out, they save energy. And if they can just make it through, a month or so, then they start to build up their but then we don't always. So that's we think is a major factor that contributes to carrying capacity here in California. Yeah.
I just want to clarify this with you, because I have read, I guess it's not true then, but I have read once that the sea otter's taste for food comes from his mother, or her mother, so that the sea otter likes crabs, for instance, it's because their mother likes crabs. And
So-
it sounds like a nice story.
Oh, it is a good story. In fact, a few of us are co-authors in that paper. So it's,
So I guess it's not true.
no, it is true actually, but it's not 100%. It's
It's not that simple.
It's like it's what it was. It's statistically significant. If you look at an adult female otter, and she has a particular specialization, she is more likely to be the same specialization as her mother than any other females of her mother's generation. So there is a tendency for females to pass on, but it's not like a guarantee or 100%. Imagine in a human culture, and this is probably actually was the case a few hundred years ago, there's a very high chance that you would have the same profession as your parents, but it wasn't guaranteed. So if your parents were woodworkers, you might be woodworkers, or if your parents were stonemasons, you might be, but then you also might branch out and do something different. It's like that.
Well, you're supposed to like the mom's food.
Right, exactly. It's complicated, and actually, that's something, after the talk, you should talk to Michelle about that. She did her whole master's thesis on this, and how these sort of, how females change their specialization when they're having pups, and how that affects whether they pass on their specialization or not. So it's kind of a complicated story, but the general story is correct, somewhat. Yeah, Jamie.
First of all, thank you. That was amazing. Thank you very much. I have two quick questions, if that's okay. First of all, do you think that the Puget Sound and the surrounding straits once had an abundant sea otter population? Second of all, are the otters in California distributed effectively in what we might call like subpopulations? In other words, what's the gene flow like?
Yeah. Well, those are both great questions. I'll take the first. So the first one. So this is the inland waters in Washington State. If you go around sort of that point and then around Vancouver Island, so Puget Sound, Strait of Point, Puget. The answer is, were there otters there? Probably. There's certainly records of in midden sites all along there. There's plenty of otter bones there, but it's not continuous. And one of the problems with looking back in historical records, there's been a lot of glacial rebound there, so the sea level change is very different than it was historically. So we don't have the same archaeological records. So that's a little bit challenging in terms of determining what was going on there, in the past. Otters did move around in the Puget Sound as the Washington population was growing, but then kind of moved back, and they still actually go there seasonally. What we think is there's probably just a lot less productivity in the types of prey that they eat. So they can go in there and they can clean up the prey pretty fast, and then those prey don't replenish themselves sufficiently quickly, so otters will move back to other areas. That's sort of a general idea that's been, but there's also been some ideas that there's higher frequencies of toxic algal blooms in those inshore waters that might also discourage otters from being there. But a lot of people are skeptical of that explanation.
And there weren't fur trade records to show a lot.
There were furs that came out of there, and they suspect that they were from there. It's really hard because the Russian ships, well, it wasn't all Russians either, but there would be fur trade centers, and the furs would all go there, and it wasn't always clear where they were coming from. But my sense is that there is evidence that otters were there, and they certainly can be there, and yet the populations from either Vancouver Island or Washington have not spread in there, even though, as I say, there was that initial foray of otters, and then kind of went back out again. Gene flow in California, it's complicated. We're working on a paper right now on exactly that question. We think there's something called cryptic genetic structure in the population. There's a few that we have 1,000 samples now. So basically a third of the population we have genetic samples from. It's not often. Over the last 20 years we have, and we've been running that throughout the entire range. There's definitely something called genetic difference by distance effects. So the farther away you move in the center of the range, the north and south, the more genetically distinct they are. But there isn't any indication of really distinct subpopulations. It's more that the farther you get away from the center, the less related you are to individuals to the north and south. So we think that's actually important. It means that the genetic effective population size is smaller than we would expect, just based on the numbers of otters. And we think the reason is this cryptic genetic structure, driven by that same pattern I just talked about, that the females have this incredibly high site fidelity. And even though males are moving around doing some gene mixing, the females are not. Yeah.
That's my question is why, do you know why they were arranged in females?
Well, I speculated before, and no one called me on it, so I'm going to stick with my speculation. We don't know for sure. I mean, they're certainly physically capable of moving. We think it does, though, have I'll say my speculation, others can say whether they agree or not, but I think it has to do with that diet specialization. I think it's to be successful, if you are a mother, and also that super high energetic cost of raising pups. So female sea otters, unlike males, right, obviously, are always either pregnant or raising a pup. As soon as they wean a pup, they are mated by a male, and then they enter the whole cycle again. So basically, from the age of first reproduction, around 3 years of age, they are pregnant or nursing the rest of their lives. And that means they have some incredibly high energetic demands. They have to survive, they have to be incredibly efficient in what they do, and we think that's what drives dietary specialization. You just, as a generalist, you just can't make it. But if you get really, really good at doing like the one thing that you're doing, your rate of energy gain is higher than if you were trying to be generalist. And we think that kind of locks them in not only to the diet specialization, but also into their particular habitat that they have to know incredibly well. So a female on her range here in Santa Cruz or Monterey would literally know every crevice, every crack in her home range inside out. She would know when the last time she visited was. Like, I haven't been there in 2 weeks, I gotta go to check, crevice number 1A and see if there's an urchin in there now. So we think that kind of locks them into that. That is I would have to say I'll call that hypothesis. It's a speculative hypothesis right now. It's consistent with what we know, but it's not been rigorously tested. Yeah.
Hi, really love the talk, it was great. Can you share insight on what's happening when sea otters spend time in rafts? And what are the things that they're doing socially or behaviorally? And by extension, like what are the advantages of hanging out in groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so that is a fantastic question. And I'll start by saying I think we've barely even begun to scratch the surface. We don't yet know what types of long-term social relationships, other than, we know that their pair bonding is very, lasts about 2 weeks, very short-lived. But we know just from research that, individual females tend to rest with the same females for many, many years. And we've done, just from looking across our resites of tagged animals, we see that there are these non-random relationships. It's not just that their home ranges overlap, but some females like other females. Maybe they could be mother-daughter, or they could be sibs, or they just could be really good friends. I think there's a whole bunch we don't know about the social interactions. We're actually working with the aquarium right now on a tag that we hope, an intelligent flicker tag that will be a peer-to-peer communications tag. It would basically, so when otters happen to be resting close together, they'll literally exchange business cards. Not real business cards, but yeah. And over time, then when one of those otters goes by a sensor, we'll get not only all that otters information, but literally every otter that it's met and every otter that it's met, who they have met, and on and on and on. So basically, we'll get a better picture of sort of the social network, if you will, of sea otters. So I think there's a ton there that we don't know about. But I'll just tell you some of the basic things we know. Non-territorial males tend to wrap in the biggest groups that we see of all. So if you went like an upward slough at the mouth of the harbor there, that's mostly non-territorial males, or sometimes you see it at Seal Bend. And there's other areas, or sometimes you see it in the middle of like Estero Bay, or different places within the range, or at the ends of the range, these big groups. Those are usually non-territorial males. And they just like to raft together. They do a lot of social interacting together. There's a general phenomenon for all social animals that you've heard called, it's predator protection basically. The more eyes you have, the less likely you are to be ambushed by a predator. So there's certainly probably some evolutionary advantages in being in a group in terms of just protection from predators. But there's probably a lot of other things that are learned, transmission of learned behavior, like for instance foraging specializations, other things, figuring out dominance hierarchies. There's a whole, I could go on for a whole bunch of, but they would all be hypotheses generating at this point. So again, that's for somebody in the next generation to figure out.
Another PhD research or something.
There, exactly, yep. That's it. Oh, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about why the upper and lower bounds of sea otter distribution kind of stopped now?
Good question.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, why has the range spread in southern sea otter along the mainland stopped? Which it hasn't. It stopped, it's the same range boundaries now as it was about 15 years ago. Before that, it was actually increasing slowly at about 3 to 5 kilometers a year. It turns out that's the exact same rate of spread that we see in southeast Alaska and in Washington, British Columbia as well. So it seems to be pretty much, that is the sort of the rate of diffusion for a population, except that California stopped. There's certainly no barriers there. What we think is going on is around that same time, in the early 2000s, the rate of shark bite mortality started going up and up and up and up really fast, and it didn't go up uniformly. It went up particularly in those areas, the south end of the range and the north end of the range. So those areas that had been kind of the engines of range expansion are now population sinks, basically. If animals go there, they're highly likely to end up on the beach with perforations in the body. So that's what we think is primarily going on. You can't have range expansion if you have a population decline sort of at the edges of the range, because that's really what drives range expansion. That's what we think is, and I think there's very strong evidence. That's more than just hypothesis at this point.
In your graph, the Elkhorn Slough in 2005 was that big drop.
Yeah.
Do we know what that was about?
No. We don't. But we just had a meeting about that a week or two ago, yeah. And we're gonna test out. We may not be able to tell, but we're gonna evaluate some of the hypotheses for what might have caused that. It was mainly that was mostly non-territorial males before that, and for whatever reason, a lot of them moved out of the slough at that time, and then a few years later, a lot of them moved back in. So, yeah.
Thought the girls were.
Exactly. Yeah, they were. Right. Yeah.
So you might not be happy with me for bringing this up, but since the census results have recently been published, I've already seen a lot of hand waving on social media and the press, and I just wondered if you could comment on the variation between years in the census results and
Yeah, right. Well, so I mentioned the shark mortality. That has been a factor, and that's something that's evident in the. So we just released the census results on Friday, I guess. So you can actually, if you just plug in sea otter census in the website, you'll jump to the Fish and Wildlife site, and it's very extensive. Any number of sites that have it right now. USGS, I guess. That being my organization. Yeah. So the population is the general sort of talking points that we have. The population is above the threshold that they have to exceed for 3 years. And I should say that the population index, so we use the 3-year running average of the raw population counts as an index of population abundance over time, trends over time. And the recovery plan for sea otters states that if that index for 3 years in a row exceeds the threshold, which happens to be 3,090, a very precise threshold, then that will trigger consideration for delisting. And there's a bunch of other factors that will go into whether they would be delisted or not. Delisting means removed from the Endangered Species Act. They would no longer have protections of the Endangered Species Act at that time. They would still have protections of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So why do we use the 3-year running average as the index and rather than the raw population count? Because I lecture in this very room. I teach quantitative ecology here, so this is just like a lecture. It's because if you look at the raw counts over time, they look something like that, okay? And this does not mean that otters plummeted down, then shot right back up again, then shot down, then shot up again, and shot down, because they're actually biologically incapable of doing that. Unless they were like insects or something, they can't produce pups that fast. So we know that these are not actual measurements of the population. So should we just stop counting otters? No, because when you connect all these dots, you get a really good idea of what the trend in the population is doing over time. And if, for instance, if a lot of those dots started doing this, and the trend did this, we'd be really, really concerned, right? So the trend is incredibly powerful statistically, but any 1 year's dot is more or less useless. It's useful in the context of the whole time series. It's not very useful if you want to look at 1 year's dot and say, oh, the population's crashing. Oh, the population's skyrocketing. Oh, it's crashing again. It's not. And people, despite the fact that I've made this lecture 1,000 times, everybody goes ahead and does that anyways. So no one in this room will ever do that for you, right? So that's why we try not to make a huge deal. If last year it was one of these jumps up, this year is one of these jumps down. There are certainly factors that make the population go up and down, but our metric of measuring population is just not that precise. And it's really hard to get a precise count of a carnivore over 1,000 kilometers of coastline. So we do the best we can. And as I say, the index is really useful over time, but any one year's count is not. So that's why I can't tell you if the population is crashing towards extinction this year. I know though, if year after year it keeps doing this down, then there'd be a lot of concern and probably some management action taken. If next year it bounces back up again, then we'll know that it was just another one of those weekends. So that's basically, that's what we're looking for. Cool. Yeah.
You do a lot of research on the population of otters in Oakland Zoo, and you talk a lot about comparing different things. What percent of the population of otters in Oakland Zoo have been rehabilitated by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and do you think that has any effect with the human interaction on any of the metrics you're measuring?
Yes, absolutely. So the Monterey Bay Aquarium has around late 1990s, 98, I think was the first one that went in. Began to, as part of the rehabilitation program, before that they're releasing rehabilitated isotoxin strand around into the central coast, mainly around Monterey Peninsula. They began, because they were concerned that their animals were disappearing, they figured they'd try the slough out, because there was this sort of small population in the slough at that time, starting in the late 1990s, and that was around the time.
Can I make a correction?
Yes.
We released them off the aquarium or where they came from, but
Yeah.
then many of them started swimming in Elkhorn Slough.
Right, yeah.
And so we made the decision to start releasing them in Elkhorn Slough to save that travel time in the hopes that that would help with their success.
Yeah.
And then we made it the place.
And then they made it the place. And then they started having pups. And that began in the early 2000s. And some of the first pups, actually, definitely the first pups that we are aware of from surveys, we actually know from those surveys were actually pups of the rehabilitated otters. We've done some work with the aquariums that are modeling that trajectory. And we, based on the analysis of them, we think that those rehabilitated pups and their offspring contributed a little over half of the population, about 55% of the increase in the population in Elkhorn Slough is attributable to the pups and the female pups and the pups of their pups and so on and so forth. So it turns out in that particular instance, the release of rehabilitated pups into that, what turned out to be a semi-distinct population, had a pretty big population effect, which is a really cool experiment to have done, even if at the time people weren't aware it was an experiment. Yeah.
Besides the tool using, is there other evidence of kind of tending to their environment or making it a better place for their food?
What do you mean? Do you mean in terms of the positive feedback? Well, I mean, the indirect effects that I mentioned before in terms of their effects in kelp course on leading more kelp, there's a strong feedback effect there because, and that's sort of part of the diet change that happens as kelp becomes more abundant, supports more inverts that are specific to those kelp beds, and that otters can then begin to switch their diets to those prey. So there's this positive reinforcement between the abundance of kelp and sea otter abundance, and also kelp offers protection for them, nursing habitat for their pups, and a variety of other things.
I meant like kind of using things around in the environment to
Can you do that?
No, I'm just wondering if
Yeah,
there's any evidence of that. It seems like I've
I'm not aware of that, although, I mean, yeah, another thing I'll mention is the soft sediment, the pits that they dig also are pretty substantially changed the habitat as well. So there's a variety of effects they have on the physical habitat. And the most dramatic is probably if you go to a place like Glacier Bay, where there's just like before I was there, it was just flat, and after I was there, it's a super complex three-dimensional habitat, because it's just a billion pits. They're all sort of joining in everywhere. So they definitely affect the physical environment, but I'm not aware of what you're saying in terms of...
What's the purpose of these pits?
Pits is how they access the clams.
Okay.
Yeah, there's all those, so that basically they dig down the conical pit, and then they expand those conical pits, and that allows them to access the clams, but it also then it increases the 3D physical reef that actually probably affects clam recruitment, so that also has this sort of feedback effect on clam population.
So it's like clam farming?
Maybe,
Okay.
yeah. No, so there's a lot we don't know about how they affect their habitat. Yeah.
Tim, maybe more hope than a question, but since it's going to be such long nights in Canada and all that, is maybe this the basis and beginnings of a book to cover your life, like Serendipity was for Tim?
I don't know. Maybe. I certainly will continue to write. Probably at some point I'll get sick of writing scientific papers and all that sort of things. Yeah. But thank you very much. That's very good. I'm happy to hang out for a little bit more and...
Yeah, we have food out here, and maybe if we mill around, you can talk to Tim one-on-one, have an opportunity to chat with the scientists and ask him questions.
Keep it from
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, keep them from leaving. We can bar the door together as a group. We can do it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.